Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our webinar today. We will be looking at and talking about, why is it important to actually go through and look at conducting industrial cybersecurity gap assessments. So we'll really, try to break down just looking at cybersecurity as a buzzword and really try to understand how it applies to industrial facilities and really what some of the best ways of getting started and looking at meeting all of the different cybersecurity requirements for industrial facilities. And so we'll see how gap assessment plays a critical role in that. We are using the GoToWebinar application, and so if at any point you have questions throughout the presentation or points where you'd like to hear more info, definitely don't hesitate to go ahead. There's a question tool that you can use to actually chat and ask any questions as we go through the presentation. I'm planning to save about 20 to 15 minutes at the end to go through and answer questions, so we will have time to review those as a group. Before jumping too much into the meat of the webinar, I like to just briefly introduce myself. My name is Patrick O'Brien, and I'm a safety and cybersecurity engineer at Exida. My background is in chemical engineering, but over time, as kind of the safety and cyber aspects have become more closely aligned, I've started to actually do double duty and work both on the HAZOPs and safety risk assessments, as well as doing cybersecurity risk assessments. So really seeing kind of how those interact and work together has been very interesting. Um, we do also want to highlight on the other side of this slide that Exida has been around for 20 years now, and that we are located globally. So each of those Exida logos around the globe represent different offices. I'm out of our Philadelphia office, so in the United States, but we do really have people located all around the globe. Um, in terms of what we do at Exida, we are a customer-focused company, and we really work with our customers to achieve safe, reliable, and secure solutions for automated systems in really all different industries. And there are three main ways that we work with that. The first are our enterprise tools, and mostly we'll think about Exlentia, but also ArcX on the OEM side. So really making sure that we get technically correct results and that we get there as efficiently as possible. We also have a certification and assessment division, so we are accredited by ANSI to provide functional safety and cybersecurity certification for components, systems, and personnel. Um, and then lastly, for our lifecycle services, this is where kind of our consultants work to solve the toughest problems, whether it's safety related alarm management or kind of as we'll talk about today, cybersecurity as well. And so in our presentation today, we're going to have kind of three main points that we go through and look at. The first will be what are some current trends for cybersecurity in the industrial control space. So we'll look at trends with attackers and existing vulnerabilities. We'll look at what's changing in terms of the systems themselves and try to understand where the industry is at from a risk perspective. What we'll then look at is what are the drivers of cybersecurity? So what are leading organizations to adopt it? We can think about how sometimes these can be helpful. Are there any hindrances to adoption? What makes it difficult to adopt cybersecurity? And then we'll look at really the benefits of conducting a cyber gap analysis and how this can, better help organizations keep up with the trends, how this can help meet some of those cybersecurity drivers, and really why that is a beneficial step to go through and do. And so if we're thinking about our first topic, our cybersecurity trends, what I want to start off with is kind of looking at some of the common cybersecurity myths that are very much still in the perceptions that are very much things that are still looked at a lot of times in the industrial space when you bring up cybersecurity. And so, one thing that we commonly hear is, cyber attacks are only a concern for big companies. So a lot of the small to mid-sized organizations, chemical facilities, other different industries may not realize that they are still an attractive target for cybersecurity, or realize, the level of attackers that may have access to the system. And so that's one that, can really be dangerous, because when you have that false sense of security, or that idea that no one would target your facility, you're not necessarily implementing security to the furthest extent. That kind of just plays right into that next one, where sometimes there's kind of that, just false idea that there aren't threat agents out there, looking to compromise your type of system. Another one that we hear a lot, and even for organizations where they are more focused on cybersecurity, they'll kind of go with the approach that security was handled during design. So, we gave that requirement to the vendor, said, hey, we need a secure system. And so that's something that, has been fully implemented already. There's nothing else that we need to do from an operations and maintenance perspective. And so while it's certainly important to use kind of certified devices and systems, really start from that secure base plate, um, you really have to be careful of putting everything to the design phase, because there are many things during operations where you can increase your cybersecurity exposure and your vulnerabilities. And we'll look at some of the things today that we're seeing as major trends where that's happening. Another one that we used to hear a lot and is starting to become less common is, my system is totally secure because it is air gapped. That idea that if we've got, our two firewalls, or if we've got our system that's fully isolated from the internet, that there's really no way for a cybersecurity incident to be a concern there. But we see time and time again that even when organizations think that they have an air gap, there are still connections to the system. Downloads still have, or updates and patches still need to be downloaded somehow. So whether it's, plugging in a USB, or, a temporary connection, there's always something that is being connected into the system. So there's really no such thing as a true air gap anymore. And then lastly, security by obscurity. So thinking that sometimes having older or out of date operating systems can make you less likely to be targeted, because attackers may not be, thinking about how to compromise that system, is again another common misconception. And we'll look at a couple of, reasons today where there are actually very significant vulnerabilities associated with these out of date, no longer patchable systems. And so if we go away from the myths and look at our current situation, think about, what we're actually seeing in industry. So one of the big trends is the increased availability of hacking tools, both for skilled and unskilled threat agents. And we'll dive in, a little bit deeper as why that's so important for industrial facilities, and what the implications of that are. We're also looking at, cybersecurity exposure and the number of attacks, and both of those, you know, are things that continue to rise. That exposure for industrial control systems is very much at an all-time high, and we'll look at a couple of the different reasons for that. Um, Another thing that really plays hand in hand with that cybersecurity exposure is remote access and the critical role that that's playing for automation systems. We're seeing it very much increase at a fast pace. Some of that has been all of the business drivers and things, for limiting costs or having better management of, remote systems. And so some of that has been in place for a while, and we've really seen that trend. But also with what's happening in the COVID-19 period, we're seeing very much critical support be provided. And so while that has had a lot of, really positive benefits for operations, there is also the potential for cybersecurity vulnerabilities and increased exposure. And so we'll talk through some of the data that we're starting to see come back for that. And then lastly, I'm kind of stepping away from, the threats and vulnerabilities. We are seeing that many organizations are starting to get away from the myths, that they're starting to, move in that direction of improved cybersecurity, but they may still be falling behind the threat environment. So because the threats are changing so rapidly, without, a truly an organizational approach, without a really thoughtful roadmap of how to achieve cybersecurity, the current actions may not be enough to get there. And so I'll talk about, what some of those shortcomings may be, and then potential ways to overcome that. When we talk about hacking tools, there are kind of two camps that we want to look at. The first are what we would call unskilled threat agents. So these could be kind of just general people. They may not have, very sophisticated hacking skills or coding skills, and they may not have any industrial control system experience. But what we're seeing is on the dark web, there are easily purchasable tools that can actually be used to execute cyber attacks. And so essentially all they would need to do is, find a system or find a login, and they already have the malware ready to deploy. Um, and so we've seen, examples of ransomware that could be purchased for $200. And so if you think about if someone's looking to, really be that enterprising, black hat, hacker, their job has become much, much easier over the years. And so with access to those tools, even a non-skilled person could lead to a significant consequence. So just thinking about, if someone's able to do some sort of phishing campaign or any sort of social engineering, that may be the only thing that they need to know how to do in order to execute a ransomware attack against a facility. And so that definitely does increase the potential exposure to um, ransomware and other types of attacks. Um, Another thing that we're seeing that is potentially even more disturbing is that those really skilled attackers are actually being able to work together and leverage more sophisticated ransomware attacks. And that's something that we've seen recently with the Soto no Kibi attack, where basically on the dark web, there is an advertisement placed for this sophisticated ransomware. It basically said, hey, we've got X number of spots. We're looking for, established hackers, send in your resumes, let us know, if you want to work with us. And basically looking at some sort of profit sharing model where the attackers get 60 to 70% of the income from a ransom, and then the developers of the code get that 30%. So actually building a whole economy of the ransomware and having those targeted, um, skilled agents going after industrial facilities or high priority targets to try to maximize the benefit. And so we're really seeing that there's just this growing economy. The threat landscape is continuing to evolve, and organizations really need to make sure that they are prepared to combat that. Um, if we look at, attacks on control systems, Kaspersky does, kind of a yearly review, sends out a survey across the globe to, look at industrial control systems and see, what organizations are experiencing attacks, and really try to understand, what are the trends, what is the direction that we're moving in. And so in 2019, 60% of the industrial control systems surveyed believed that they experienced a cybersecurity incident or didn't have, the ability to confidently say that they haven't experienced one. And moving from 2018, that actually represents a relatively sharp increase. In 2018, over half of the control systems surveyed, said that they were confident that they hadn't experienced an attack. So looking at around, a 10 or so percent jump. And so the question is, where is that increase coming from? Is it that the, just increase in attacks is so rapid? Is it that organizations have become better at identifying cybersecurity incidents and so maybe more willing to say, hey, actually we did see something, or more aware that, just because we aren't, seeing it yet doesn't mean we haven't experienced an attack. So there are a number of different things that could really be driving this number, but it's, oftentimes we're always asking either or, when it's most likely, both. So we're probably are seeing some uptick in attacks, as well as organizations, continuing to improve their awareness, which is really starting to drive up, that understanding of the attacks. But in either case, we're talking about over half of the industrial control systems are expected to see and are looking at cybersecurity incidents every year. So the idea that, for, a smaller facility or for, your personal facility, that there's really no likelihood of being targeted, it just isn't something that's really backed up by the data anymore. Another thing that we're seeing in terms of trends is remote access to the control systems. From that same survey, they actually found that 70% of industrial control systems require some type of remote access. So thinking about whether it's remote maintenance capabilities or any sort of remote monitoring, um, the vast majority of control systems now have some type of authorized established remote access. And what we're seeing is, that was in 2019. Today, looking at during the pandemic, very many automation professionals are working from home to do critical job functions. And so while on the one hand, that's been extremely positive for, a large number of facilities to continue operations with the minimum number of on-site personnel, it does also result in the potential increase for cybersecurity exposure and a greater vulnerability to different cybersecurity attacks. And a couple of the things that we can see that really highlight why this remote access can lead to that concern is, just thinking about for remote desktop port or RDP protocol ports, thinking about how many of those are actually facing the internet, things where people are able to just find them. And so from January of this year to March of this year, the number of those has jumped from 3 million to 4.5 million. So a 50% increase in just 3 months. And so really a lot of that is being driven by the increase in remote personnel and the increase in access. And we're now seeing more and more of these ports exposed to the internet. And so what that means is, what is the risk of that is Shodan is really a relatively common search tool for attackers. It's basically a way to identify devices connected to the internet and start figuring out where they come from. So there are now 4.5 million RDP ports facing the internet that attackers can find and leverage for attacks. And so all that they need to do once they identify the port is either um, do some sort of phishing campaign to gain the credentials. Brute force campaigns are very common where they can just try a large number of passwords until they find the correct one, or for ports that haven't been updated. The common and default passwords are often in use as well. And so for all of these devices, there are common websites where you can track and actually see what that default password is. And so attackers, typically in some combination of those techniques, can very easily get access to those devices. In addition to talking about the exposure, we also want to think about the remote access vulnerabilities. And so it's not just that the devices can now be found. There are known vulnerabilities that attackers have the ability to exploit for these remote connection systems. And so in 2019, Microsoft released an advisory for a number of known vulnerabilities in the remote desktop services, both for Windows 7, the Windows Server 2008 and 2008 R2, and then also older systems such as Windows 2003 and Windows XP. And so thinking about that kind of security by obscurity, or the reason why it's okay to use older systems. Windows 7 is no longer being supported by Microsoft. They're no longer releasing any patches, and so that known vulnerability is, any existing Windows 7 systems are susceptible to it, and any attackers who are able to find that, or any remote connections that are done through Windows 7 can be compromised. There are vulnerabilities in there such that attackers can really establish access that way without compromising accounts. And so you really have to be careful of any legacy systems being used for remote access. Additionally, kind of like we talked about before, even if you're using an up-to-date patch system, they're still susceptible to those brute force attacks. They're still susceptible to phishing and other common attack techniques. And so one example of when the Sotonokibi ransomware was deployed was actually really just a brute force attack of a remote desktop protocol for a operating facility. They're able to get in through that remote access point. They deployed the ransomware and shut down 3 systems that were critical for running that facility. And really just through that, we're able to have a very significant cyber incident through those remote access points. And so if that kind of, gives us the information of the current threats, if we think about what's being done to combat that, we can look at, organizations increasing their cybersecurity preparedness, more ready to deal with those. But we're seeing that it's typically through, individuals in the organization really try to be the drivers of that. We're not necessarily seeing, organization-wide implementation yet. Um, Sometimes, what's required for clear cybersecurity management isn't there, looking at the coordination between all the different groups involved. And so we're seeing that, organizations are definitely, making strides forward, but they're not all the way there yet. The last thing that we are seeing a big uptick in is interest in intrusion detection services and sort of that continuous monitoring on the network, um, because more and more organizations are accepting that cybersecurity incidents aren't a question of if, it's really more a question of when. And so thinking about if there is a cyber incident, how are we going to identify that it happens, and how are we going to respond in the most effective way? So there are certainly positive indications in terms of growing cybersecurity awareness, but we do want to, we're really not seeing that the organizations are fully there yet. And so there's still, a lot of room for growth and room for improvement. Um, And so if we think about them, what are those drivers? What are things that, organizations can really look at to support that idea to move in a more secure direction? And so we'll talk about, from a facility risk management standpoint, why cybersecurity is really becoming a business imperative, and something that every operating facility needs to consider. Um, Kind of hand in hand with that, we'll look at the cost of cybersecurity incidents, whether it's equipment replacement, downtime, or physical damage, and kind of think about, how the increasing likelihood and the increasing exposure combined with this cost really leads to that facility risk management approach. We'll talk about, what sort of regulatory requirements are there? Um, are there insurance requirements? And then what are the international standards? What are the industry best practices that can be used as a benchmark, and really to help move those organizations forward? So if we think about, what an organization or what a facility's, kind of key task is for risk management, we can think about, there are just 3 fundamental drivers for it, 3 things that, obligations that must be met. So the first is a moral obligation. And so if companies, just thought about the moral aspect of risk management, they would make the plant, as safe as possible, fully disregarding, the cost of any, cybersecurity protections or safety protections, and just implement all of those. From a financial perspective, they would just build the lowest cost plant, they'd have the lowest operating budget, and they'd really just focus on, pushing product out. And then lastly, from a legal standpoint, it would just be complying 100% with the regulations as they are written, and not really looking at any sort of the actual risk or cost associated. And so, by doing just one of those things, organizations would be missing the whole picture. But by really looking at all 3 of those areas, that is the current operating environment. And it makes sense that organizations can't ignore the financial aspect, because if they're not profitable, they're not going to be able to hire employees, and that's clearly not the most beneficial place either. So it really takes balancing all 3 of those areas um, to achieve effective risk management. And so keeping that in mind, when we think about, cybersecurity risk, we're talking about 2 main factors. The consequence, so the amount of loss or damage that can be expected, um, as well, so talking about whether it's monetary, political, um, effectiveness of operations. We'll look at some of the different risk receptors that can be affected by cyber. And we're also talking about the likelihood of the attack. So what are the things that would drive how likely it is for an attacker to be successful? If we break this down a little bit further and think about how can we estimate the likelihood of successful cyber attacks, what are the variables that are going to come into play? There are really three factors. So the first is threats. So thinking about the people or circumstance with the potential to cause loss or damage to an asset. And so in terms of current trends that we're seeing with threats, we talked about those tools being available to less skilled attackers. So we're continuing to see increases in the number of threat agents or people out there who could attack industrial systems. So that's something that we're certainly seeing go up. In terms of vulnerabilities, so thinking about weaknesses that can be exploited um, to gain access to an asset. And so in addition to vulnerabilities, we can kind of talk about, what is the attack surface? What is the, size of the facility? What's, available on the network? What is there for attackers to try to exploit, to try to find vulnerabilities in? And typically, the larger the attack surface, the more vulnerabilities are going to be present. And so we can kind of, look at vulnerabilities both as, what are the known vulnerabilities out there, and then also what is kind of the general cybersecurity exposure. But again, as we looked at in our trends, remote access is way up. Vulnerabilities in some more recent legacy systems such as Windows 7 are increasing. So there's more and more known about how to really take advantage of that operating system. And then the last one is attractiveness of the target. And so it's the estimated value of that target to an adversary. So it could either be, how much ransom they would expect to get out of that facility, or are there specific political or economic or environmental drivers that would make a facility, a more desirable target? And so that's something that, could be looked at for each of the sites individually. But certainly for the first two components, those have been continuing to increase over time. And so we're seeing that attacks are becoming more likely, and that's reflected by how many organizations are seeing security incidents. And then if we think about, so not just the likelihood is going up, but what is the consequence of cybersecurity attacks? What are those costs? And, why is that something that drives us to look at cybersecurity implementation? So from a risk standpoint, certainly looking at safety, we've seen more attacks in recent years actually target personnel safety. So looking to not only cause lost production, but actually trigger explosions and other unsafe situations. For manufacturing facilities, we can talk about product safety and think about, are there things that can be done from a food standpoint or anything that could potentially impact the consumers? For environmental, we have seen attacks result in environmental releases that can be, depending on the facility, very significant in terms of environmental damage. Um, and then what we have seen are, primarily financially driven attacks. So thinking about what the cost is to lose production for one day, or for, if you've got some sort of ransomware attack that impacts your controls, how long are you going to be down before you can recover? For one of the organizations, hit by the Sotonokibi attack, it was over 50 million euros just to, come back from that one incident. For the NotPetya attack back in 2018, um, the total worldwide cost for that one wiperworm attack was over $10 billion. And there were a number of different industrial facilities, at least 5 or 6 across different industries, where the cost for that company alone was over $100 million. And so these cyber attacks, really can have very significant cost impact in terms of lost production, equipment damage both to the network and also to the physical operating equipment. Thinking about, can you lose competitive advantage if there's some sort of data breach? Um, is there a loss of product? And so those are really things that are continuing to drive organizations from a risk-based perspective to see the need for cybersecurity, to understand that, yes, this is something that we need to really put a focus on. We can look at, loss of privacy and company image as two other areas where cybersecurity attacks can also have harm or really monetary consequences as well. So there's a lot from the risk landscape that really can be impacted by cybersecurity. And so thinking about that and keeping that in mind is really important for guiding cybersecurity adoption. So in addition to being driven by the requirements of facility risk management, we're also seeing an increase in the regulatory requirements for cybersecurity. So thinking about what's necessary to comply in the U.S., for a lot of industries, they're driven by specific regulations. So for wastewater, AWA now has cybersecurity requirements, including basically a risk assessment as well as a number of procedures and incident response plans. NERC-CIP has very specific guidelines, um, for power. OSHA PSM, really one of the most common ways for meeting this in the US is actually demonstrating compliance with 61511. And we've seen that 61511 has started to move to include cyber requirements. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more in the international standards. But just kind of keep that in mind that if you are using 61511 as a way to show compliance to OSHA PSM, cybersecurity is now a mandatory step in that. And we're not just seeing those changes in the US. For the UK, the HSE has put out operational guidance and so have specific things that they are looking for cybersecurity. And the auditors, when they are going into the plants, have specific questions about cybersecurity that need to be, you need to have answers prepared for those. China is also pushing security laws and has very much, more stringent cybersecurity requirements coming into play. And those are just some of the more the ones that I'm personally familiar with. But we know that we're seeing this trend in many different countries for many different groups really starting to push that. And then the last thing to think about is, even in the US where a lot of times it's not so much regulatory driven for risk management or compliance with these standards, it's still a critical factor for insurance coverage. Cybersecurity insurance is one of the fastest growing insurance areas. It's becoming absolutely critical and something that the insurance agents are very much talking about and asking when they meet with sites to try to understand how is that going to impact the likelihood of loss for that site. And so even if there isn't a specific regulatory requirement, it's still something that is absolutely critical to the insurance coverage for a facility. And so if we think about, the international standards and kind of where they fit with the regulatory requirements, this is more of an attempt to codify industry best practice, provide a, repeatable performance-based way to achieve security and give really helpful guidance for that. But the key with, the standards that we'll be looking at is that it's not a prescribed design. It's giving us, repeatable and measurable criteria to assess security, but it's not saying, thou shall design it exactly this way or use this component. And so the benefit of that is that it really does allow organizations to take a pragmatic approach and figure out what is most important for their facility. And so the two standards that we'll really think about coming into play for cybersecurity are IEC 61511, so thinking about functional safety for the process industry, and the latest edition in 2016, cybersecurity requirements have been added. And so although, it's now 2020, so 4 years later, at first, not that many organizations were really taking the cyber portion to heart, but we've actually seen relatively recently, this is rapidly changing and more organizations are saying, hey, we need to have cyber if we're going to comply with the 61511 requirements and actually make big strides towards improving the risk assessment, improving the level of focus. Um, and then 62443 is a specific set of standards just for cybersecurity. It looks at cybersecurity management, system capabilities, and a number of other pieces for actually all different stakeholder groups. So not only asset owners, but also service providers and integrators, as well as the equipment manufacturers and suppliers. And so there's a lot available in terms of resources for how to achieve cybersecurity for industrial facilities. If we look at the updates to 61511 in a little bit more in depth, we won't talk through all of those points now, but what it is important to know is that for the safety instrumented system, conducting a risk assessment that includes at least the threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences is necessary. And so at the result of that, you really need to document what protections are in place and really make sure from a cyber standpoint that you do have adequate risk reduction. So 61511 is really pushing organizations to doing that detailed cyber risk assessment. And that's something that needs to be shown for any companies where compliance with 61511 is a requirement. And so if we think about, looking at the trends we're seeing in cybersecurity, if we're thinking about the drivers that are pushing organizations to need to adopt it, the question is, where does a cyber gap fit in with that? And so we'll talk about 4 ways that a cyber gap can help. So the first is increasing the speed of cyber implementation, kind of hand in hand with that, also decreasing the overall cost of cybersecurity protections, improving the understanding of the risk exposure, and then documenting that compliance or the intent, how the organization meets the intents for regulation, industry best practice, and international standards. And so all 4 of those areas are why we see gap assessment as a beneficial step. So how can a gap assessment increase the speed of implementation? So the first thing that it'll do is it can help you create a roadmap to improve cybersecurity. So thinking about not only where you are, thinking about where you want to go, how you're going to meet your requirements for regulation or insurance, and then thinking about what are the prioritized recommendations, what is a strategic way to get to that goal, and then what is the time frame for doing that. It'd be one thing to say, hey, cybersecurity, it's a big deal. By tomorrow, everything's 100% up to snuff, up to code. Security, we're ready to go. You may be able to say that, but there's no way that you're going to get there, make all of those changes overnight. So really thinking about what is an acceptable time frame to implement security, and what are the most important things that we need to do first. What are things that we need to work on as an organization and roll out over time, to not only make sure that we're getting there in a practical way, but that we're covering the highest risk areas first. And so really having that clear path, having that roadmap, can greatly increase the speed of implementation. And so, where we think about decreasing the cost of, cybersecurity protections, again, focusing that time and energy on the most important issues. So really reducing that risk inventory, um, looking at, all right, we've got remote access. What are we doing to protect it? Do we have outdated systems? Do we have um, anything that is, has a known vulnerability? And so really one of the biggest costs for organizations when implementing cybersecurity is actually the time that their people spend on it, and the time that it takes to push and drive these programs. So you really want to make sure that that time and energy is going to the most important issues. Part of that is also, avoiding high cost protections if they're not having a significant benefit. And so one of the things that we like to say is, the most sophisticated and expensive cybersecurity protection measures won't be effective if physical and personnel security aren't managed. So it doesn't matter, what sort of intrusion protection system or the firewalls or everything that's used, if the personnel on those systems, if all of their accounts can be easily hacked, if they're walking up and plugging in USB sticks. And so really making sure that you've got a holistic approach that not just addresses the network, but also the people, is really critical to actually reducing that risk. Another step for decreasing costs is actually improving the efficiency by coordinating cybersecurity with existing risk management, looking at how to build it into requirements for suppliers and service providers. So really having that full program and not just specific actions for security. And so by doing that, you can not only reduce the risk for cybersecurity, so the likelihood that you're going to see a successful attack, but also thinking about just increasing that system uptime does have very much a positive financial impact. The next thing that a gap assessment can help with is understanding the existing cybersecurity exposure, the existing cybersecurity risk. And so we talked about, the attack surface is that summation of the vulnerabilities and, reachable or exploitable to threat agents. So, the different entry points to the systems, and we can think about attack surfaces in the network. Um, so, are your firewall rules, have they not been updated for 10 years? Is there some sort of permit all rule there? Or are there more devices on your network than are needed? Do you have a bunch of remote access points that are outward facing? Talking about the software or hardware. So do you have exposed ports? Do you have, legacy systems that aren't patched? Are there known vulnerabilities on your system that attackers could gain access to? Um, and then also thinking about social engineering, thinking about the people, the number of access accounts, how well protected are those? And so really all of those factors, play a role in, what's the overall attack surface or the attack surface area where threat agents will be able to try and gain access to the system. And so really the takeaway is an effective gap assessment is going to give you information on all three of those areas. It's gonna look at not only the procedures, but also the network and the accounts, and really provide practical guidance based on that. And so in the follow-up webinar next month, we'll actually dive into what makes an effective gap analysis, and really talk about how all of these different areas need to be looked at. Um, and so then lastly, talking about how do we meet the intent of um, regulatory requirements or best practices. So the one thing that we do want to emphasize is that 100% compliance with a regulation or a standard doesn't mean achieving your goals. You really have to think about where's the organization trying to go and what is critical for them to achieve for security. So thinking about the first step is, identifying what regulations apply, and documenting then how you go out and meet those regulations. So, for organizations not in the water industry, it doesn't make sense for them to, jump onto those OWL requirements and just say, hey, we've got 100% compliance with that. Um, Now, what they may want to do is look at those regulations and see, hey, are there pieces of that that are beneficial to my industry segment? And are there things that I should pull from that? And industry best practice, as well as looking at what's going on in other industries, kind of gives a good idea and helps to build an understanding of what are the important steps for security. From there, then, you want to have a clearly documented approach, considering that industry best practice or those other international standards, whether it's just meeting the requirements of 61511 or pulling in that 62443 approach. And so the benefit with that then is really demonstrating your improved cybersecurity implementation to anyone who's coming in to audit the facility, whether they're from a regulatory agency or from insurance, to demonstrate that level of cybersecurity preparedness. And so if we think about all of those different areas, that's really where the gap assessment can come in and be helpful. So just to recap, we looked at some of the common trends in terms of increasing attacks and remote access. We looked at what are the drivers for cybersecurity in industry. And then we talked about really where does a gap analysis fit in with those drivers and trends, and how can it be beneficial to operating facilities. So just to wrap up, we really do hope that everyone is staying safe and following the guidelines for stay at home and social distancing. In this time, exida is very much still supporting um, the safety, cybersecurity, and alarm management needs. And we've got a lot of different ways that we're doing that for our different groups. But we've improved our remote meetings, we've developed remote certification processes, we've enhanced training options, and also put our online personnel certifications, things that can now be taken fully remotely. So we are really committed to continuing that interaction and supporting all of those needs. Um, for training, part of that has been our live streaming room. And so we do have a number of online live classes that are in a really great workshop. I've had the pleasure of actually teaching one of our courses in there. And we've basically got a full green screen setup. We've got some very nice cameras so you can actually, not only see the instructor when you're taking the online course, but also the slides. We've got views for whiteboards, and so it really helps make the course more interactive. So the slides will be sent out with some of those upcoming courses. The one that I will just plug a little bit is this June 9th to 10th CS 102 Industrial Cybersecurity course. I'll be the instructor for that one. And so, if you're thinking about implementing more cybersecurity, but kind of want a little bit of a better understanding of the overall approach, that is a really great training course to take. It's 2 days. We go through some workshops and we really just kind of work on, what's a pragmatic implementation of the cybersecurity lifecycle. So if you are interested, don't hesitate to reach out with me with any questions on that one. The other thing that we've been doing is really increasing the number of online self-paced training courses. And so we've pushed out 3 new online self-training courses. We've got some for functional safety as well as cybersecurity. So it really is a great opportunity to improve the background knowledge for cybersecurity. Um, Lastly, the slides will have links to all the different places to follow exida. And now we'll be in good shape to go through. I did see some questions come in, so we can take some time to address those now. If you do have any questions that you haven't asked yet, don't be afraid to put them in. Okay, so the first one would be a question about services in Qatar to look at cyber risk assessment, and then looking at, is cybersecurity applicable to telecom systems, and would you, think about the same thing from a risk perspective? So the first question is, yes, we have done a number of cybersecurity services and functional safety services in Qatar. And so we can have support for that both out of the US as well as our South Africa office. So that is absolutely something that we can help with. For telecom systems, cybersecurity is definitely still a very critical piece of the puzzle. We would look at, for the specific scope, some of it would be very much the same approach to the industrial facilities in terms of risk assessment. There may be some pieces that are different, but we would certainly look at kind of a custom fit approach to that. But a lot of times doing that initial gap assessment is a good first step to really understand, what the current vulnerabilities are and think about from a risk standpoint, what are the most critical systems to protect. Okay. Um, so this next one is looking for, what's an example of a high cost, cybersecurity protection system that may have a limited benefit. And so what we could talk about here, is thinking about, you could, tear apart the whole network. You could segment everything with, state-of-the-art firewalls, get some sort of, continuous monitoring protection. But if you're not doing other things like working on improving, cybersecurity awareness within the organization, looking at really preventing that physical access, all of those, network protections that, will cost time to do, aren't going to improve the security because there are still those basic vulnerabilities out there. And so it, may not necessarily be that they're, the most expensive protections in place, but if, you're missing part of the risk, you won't be getting the return on investment for the different cybersecurity protections. So it's really thinking about that holistic approach and providing the protection for all of those different areas. And so kind of one of the other questions that was asked is, cybersecurity doesn't that mostly come down to, patches, having a DMZ, focusing on the awareness and physical access? And so that is something where, um, those are absolutely key pieces of the puzzle. And so you could think that, you would want to make sure that you're improving on all of those areas and not just investing all of the time or energy into one of them. So that's more of kind of where the practical approach comes in. One of the questions is, do we have the ability to um, carry out remote cybersecurity risk assessments for the current scenario? And so yes, that's absolutely something that we are able to do. We've gotten really, I did a webinar last month on remote HAZOP and kind of outlining some of the things that we've done to do successful HAZOP assessments. We can do absolutely the same approach for remote cyber risk assessments. So what we do is we'll share two screens. One will be the Exponential Cyber software where we'll document the analysis. The other will typically be a network diagram or other reference material. And so we'll kind of walk through the network. We'll document, the cause consequence pairs. Some other things that we've done are we've actually set up organizations with a number of vulnerability scanners that they can run themselves. So there's a lot that we can do to kind of get that holistic picture remotely. Um, so then this question is thinking about for the manufacturers with robotics, what is need to be done to improve their product security, or is it at the end user level? So that's a good question to kind of think through, what stakeholders need to be involved in cybersecurity, and where does the responsibility fall between the um, manufacturer and the end user? So what we would say is that from a product standpoint, there is security certification on the product level that looks at security capabilities. So thinking about things like the capabilities for access and login. How do you protect the code from being modified? So there's a lot that manufacturers should look at. And part of what's driving the manufacturers is more and more end users are starting to require that. Say, hey, we want to see your cybersecurity processes, and make sure that when we're building the components that we are having those you know that known starting point, that set um, level of risk. So it is kind of, again, not an either or requirement for security. A lot of times we're seeing both groups um, working on that. Alrighty, so um, if there aren't any more questions, thank you guys very much for being an attentive audience. We really appreciate you having you on the webinar today. Um, Please, if you are interested, we will be doing a follow-on webinar next month to look at, kind of the cyber gap process and, what goes into a gap to really achieve those goals and give us some of the benefits that we talked about. And so what we'll do is we'll kind of, look forward to having you on that call as well. Please don't hesitate. My email will be in the slides that go out. So I'm always interested to get any of your questions, or if you have suggestions for other webinar topics. Um, my name is Patrick O'Brien, and again, thank you for joining. Have a great day and take care.